welcome to the Mobile Minute. I'm Lee Barnes, CTO of Utopia Solutions, and today we're going to discuss techniques for selecting test configurations, specifically which platforms, OS versions, and devices we're going to test against. It would certainly be nice to think that we could test against all possible combinations and permutations, but as we'll discuss, in the world of mobile testing, that likely isn't possible, and more importantly, probably not warranted. So what's so different about testing mobile apps that we need to be concerned about test configurations? Well, the reality is that it's not all that different from testing for browser compatibility, except that there's a few more moving parts. Testing the app functionality is only the tip of the mobile testing iceberg. In addition to the functionality, we have a layer of non-functional test cases that are inherent to the app running on a mobile platform. Things like interrupts, incoming calls, SMS messages, or other alerts. Conditions, including varying signal strength, loss of signal, changing networks from carrier to Wi-Fi. And we have device-specific conditions, things like screen orientation, GPS, accelerometer, and device button mappings. Next, we have the mobile platforms. The big two, of course, are iOS and Android, but for some apps, we need to consider 3, 4, or even more mobile platforms. What's worse is that you have multiple versions of the OS on each platform to consider. Finally, we have the devices themselves. In addition to variances in OS, variants across devices must be considered. Factors like screen size and resolution, screen type, form factor, processor, memory, etc. can all affect the way your app looks and behaves. So how do we adapt? We must continually analyze and prioritize our testing effort, but this is really no different from what we already do as accomplished testers. We can always find more to test. Our job is to make sure we're doing the appropriate testing based on the context of the application and business objectives. So in order to analyze and prioritize, what do we need to look at? First, we need to look at the functionality and technology of the app we're testing. What platforms and versions is it being deployed on? If your app is only being deployed on iOS, we can eliminate all the other platforms. How does your application integrate with the device? What device features does it use? This will help us understand the types of devices we need to consider. Next, we want to understand the business objectives behind the app. If the organization has put together a mobile strategy, this can probably be found here. You want to understand the application's value to the business. Similarly, we need to understand the risk to the business if the application fails. Finally, we need to understand the target user demographics of the app. Once you understand the user demographics, you can start to put together some information on the user profile, what types of devices they use, etc. This information may come from statistics on similar apps, ideally within the same user base, or other relevant sources. All this information eventually comes together to drive your target test configurations. In a minute, we're going to look at a mini case study. But to lead up to that, I wanted to look at the fragmentation across Android and iOS to better help us understand how to select specific OS versions as test configurations. Let's assume for a minute that we wanted to get 80% coverage across the available platform OS versions. If we looked at Android, we need to go all the way back to version 2.3.3 to get 80% coverage, while on iOS, we'll only need to go back a couple versions to version 5.1. Now let's use that information for a mini case study for test configuration selection on native application platforms. So let's again assume we're looking for 80% OS coverage. All right, the first step is really the easiest, at least for native apps. We need to determine what platforms the app is being developed for. In this case, we already know it's iOS and Android. Now we need to look at the available OS versions for our selected platforms. And in this case, there's 13 in total, 8 Android and 5 for iOS. I've included all the OS versions from each of the selected platforms to give us 99% of the user base. Our target is 80% coverage on each platform, so using the data from the previous slide, we can reduce the number of configurations down to 7, 5 Android and 2 for iOS. Note that if you look closely at your specific user demographics, you may be able to reduce the configurations further. It's very possible that your users are skewed towards newer devices or a specific platform. Now we need to look at the specific devices we're going to select from. Let's look at iOS first because it's the easiest, and it always is. Apple has 3 devices that run on the versions of iOS that we've selected. Android's a different story. If you selected all the devices that ran the Android versions that are in consideration, you couldn't fit them on a large conference room table. Clearly, we have to look more closely. We need to look at the app functionality to understand how the device will be used, how it might be affected by screen size, resolution, orientation, processor requirements, etc. We then need to look at how the app integrates with the device. What type of features does it use, such as location services, accelerometer, camera, etc. And finally, we can again look at user demographics to understand what devices are prevalent in our prospective user base. We typically look at extreme boundary conditions when looking at Android devices, so large screen size, high-end processor, small screen size, lower-end processor, memory, storage, etc., to reduce the very large pool of available resources down to something that's much more conceivable to work with. In this specific case, we've selected 5 devices, 3 Android and 2 iOS. Note that we might be testing multiple versions of the Android OS on a specific device model. So it's important to understand that just because we've selected 7 OS configurations, it doesn't necessarily mean we'll have a minimum of 7 different devices. It's also important to mention that smartphones and tablets may be considered separately, especially if they have specific builds for each form factor. Depending on the number of test configurations, it may not be practical to test all test cases on all configurations. You'll need to prioritize them. We typically categorize our configurations into primary and secondary. Primary configurations get all the functional and mobile-specific test cases, while the secondary configurations get the minimum functional test cases, maybe a smoke test, build sanity check, etc., and all the mobile-specific test cases. We test mobile-specific test cases in all configurations as they are more likely to be affected by platform, OS, or device differences. We prioritize using a weighted mobile configuration matrix shown here. We weight each OS and device according to the importance to us. This is often the same information we use to identify the configurations as targets in the first place. These are admittedly subjective, and we occasionally need to adjust the weightings if we find the ratio of primary to secondary configurations is skewed too far one way or the other. As a baseline, though, we expect a 2 to 3 ratio between primary and secondary configurations. That'll be adjusted a bit based on risk, etc., but in general, that's our starting point. So to summarize key points, we want to understand our app's technology, business objectives, and user profile. We want to use this information to then identify potential platforms, OS versions, and devices that we may need to consider. Then we want to prioritize those potential test configurations using a weighted test configuration matrix. Finally, we want to monitor usage of our app so we can continually refine our analysis and prioritization to make sure that we're testing the appropriate test configurations. So that wraps up our discussion on test configuration selection. Again, this is Lee Barnes, CTO of Utopia Solutions, and we look forward to seeing everyone next time on the Mobile Minute.